Hi, congratulations for making it so far. Looking forward to debating you. I think this probably because for the first time, it's one that is true in the country that I live in and not true in the United States, where I assume you hail from. Australia has compulsory voting. It works incredibly well. We have voting rates consistently in every level of government over about 85%. My claim is not just going to be that that number is good in and of itself, although I think it arguably is, but also that it improves the way in which democracy plays out. And my essential claim here is going to be that the reasons that people do not vote and then are inspired to vote under a compulsory voting system are generally bad reasons, are not reflective of their interests or their will, and are not things that our system should necessarily respect. So in terms of what I'm proposing, very simply, I'll just do what we do in Australia already. That is to say, we have a $20 first-time fine and then a $50 fine for every instance after the first circumstance in which you don't vote. You're put on the voting roll automatically when you turn, I think, 17. You're able to update your enrollment status, and that's the responsibility of you. It's a low fine. If you have any good excuse for it, the government tends to let you off it. The rate of the fine occurring is generally very low. The larger effect of the fine is to create a norm in which individuals are encouraged to vote. With that said, you don't need to care about the enforcement levels too much because almost everyone in reality does vote. So my first argument, very simply, is that the people who don't vote under a system who don't vote should be voting. Basically, there are a set of small hurdles that in the voting day means that some kinds of people don't vote. This is why disproportionately it's young people or relatively poor people who aren't voting in the United States, and why there are disproportionate voting rates among the old and wealthy. Maybe that's because they don't need to spend as much time with the kids because they can afford a babysitter. Maybe it's because they don't need to take a crowded public transport system, which takes them 3 times longer than driving their automobile. Maybe it's because their boss is more flexible about giving them more time off at work. Whatever the reason, essentially what we know is that poor people have fewer options, and even if they might like to vote, they don't really have the ability to vote. And even if they had the ability to vote, it's inconvenient to them to the point where they don't vote. The thing is, overwhelmingly, those people regret not voting when they find out that the government of the day is one that is massively ignorant of their interests. And that is why, for instance, in Great Britain, which has voluntary voting, even though the government has tried to cut every single area of public spending, they have not done so when it comes to pensions or any other sort of old age care spending, because they know that's a more reliable bank of voters. So I'll pass the mic over to you and see what you have to say.
Okay, so I'm really, really glad to be debating this with an actual Australian. I presume has never tried to vote in the United States. So I'm going to make my own points first, and then I'll address the stuff that you've said. So yeah, it is important to vote in a presidential election, but fail to vote penalties are regressive, and they unfairly target those who are the most disenfranchised already, as you already mentioned, so I don't need to go over that. I'd like to mention that also that in Australia, even though they do have compulsory voting, the most recent statistic that I was able to find is only 58% of Indigenous people were able to vote. And so this is some data from the American Bar Association, and they place common barriers to voting into these 2 major categories. This is in the US, obviously. Difficulty registering. So approximately 21 million Americans, that's almost the population of Australia, lack non-expired state-issued photo ID, and you have to show this when you register. Typically, you also have to show it at a polling place, which, as far as I can tell, you don't have to do in Australia. Show your ID, and it has to be one of these specific kinds at the polling place. So obviously the people that are the most disenfranchised are the least likely to have that for whatever reason. If you were born abroad, many people, especially of the older generation of specific populations of people, were born at home or not in a hospital. So it's in one state, a voter testified before her own state senate, saying that it took about 2 days and 14 hours to get a state ID. In Arizona, about 31,000 people had their registration forms rejected because they didn't provide adequate documentation of proof of citizenship or an adequate ID. So that's quite a few people that are not able to vote. There are huge, huge hurdles to registration here in the United States. It's actually very, very difficult. So difficulty voting itself. The median wait time for the presidential election in Florida was 90 minutes. This is in 2016, which might seem long until you consider that in 2012 it was 7 hours. So again, those that are already disenfranchised are the ones that are not likely to have 7 spare hours on a Tuesday, a weekday. It's not a holiday, that can't miss work. So that's like parents, etc., right? The very elderly. If we want to make more people vote, we need to make it easier. motor voter or automatic vote by mail. Australia, you said that people are automatically put on the roll. That's not true here in the US. We should have that, obviously. There should be no day of voter ID requirements. They don't have that in Australia. We shouldn't have it here. We should have extended early voting periods and voting on a weekday or sorry, a weekend or a holiday. It's on a Saturday, I believe. Here it's on a Tuesday. Tax fair, unkind, and regressive. Until we fix the other stuff, making voting compulsory just is cruel, because the people that already can't vote are just now having to pay a fine when it's so arduous to vote in the first place. So the poor people who have fewer options will regret it later. Perhaps they might regret it later, but on that day, it's very challenging to be able to register, to be able to actually go and vote.
I'm very confused by your case. If it is true that we should implement the things that you described before we institute our policy, sorry, my policy, then that seems fine. But all of the benefits that I've described after the point that you access seem kind of irrelevant at that point. Like, it seems that if you, by and large, lower the barriers to people being able to vote and being able to access voting, then that seems to me that it would fix that problem, and then compulsory voting would be a desirable end for the reason that I've already described. The second thing that I'd say, though, is even in a context, so I agree there is the potential for it to have a regressive element to it. That is generally why enforcement agencies in Australia give extremely wide latitudes to excuses. It's important to remember that the vast majority of enforcement of voting problems does not occur in Indigenous communities, because in circumstances in which people do not have access to voting in the way that we're meant to provide it, then they don't go and enforce it in those areas, because they know that all of those people are going to have a good excuse as to why they were incapable of voting on a voting day. It's important also to note, though, that number has been trending up quite consistently, partially, I think, due to the norm that is created by compulsory voting, the idea that everyone should be voting. It's regarded as one of our great national shames that we have such low voter engagement for Indigenous people. But the next thing to say about that statistic is that 58% of Indigenous people voting is still higher than the average across the whole population in the United States of voting. And I think that is why, even though Indigenous policy construction is not done perfectly and definitely could be done better in Australia, there is far better engagement and far better treatment of Indigenous people in the voting system than there is for instance, of minority communities in the United States, where the voting levels are incredibly low, particularly amongst young people, realistically, and they get treated very badly. So yeah, I mean, I agree with your sort of mechanistic fixes. I think that you need a suite of reforms, and I think those reforms largely erase the problems that you're describing. I think that if you successfully institute those things and compulsory voting, then you don't have the problems that we have in Australia that you described, that wouldn't exist in a country like Australia, which has done most of the things that you're describing to a great degree of success. So I just don't really understand where the harm in your case comes from. Either it's a system in which most people do not want to vote because it's difficult, in which case we need to do something a little bit regressive in order to massively reshape electoral boundaries so that you get policy that better represents everyone, or you need to do the alternative, which is fixing everything, in which case you might as well have a policy that leads to more marginal but still significant improvements.
So here, if you didn't understand, here's kind of a breakdown of where I was going with that. The resolution says people should be fined if they don't vote in presidential elections, which is compulsory voting as they have in Australia. That's not a suite of reforms. A suite of reforms would be very helpful, but just compulsory voting is not a suite of reforms. So the resolution doesn't say that. I fully advocate for automatic voter registration, motor voter. They have that in a state, Oregon. Here in the US, we're trying to get it in California. It would be amazing if we could get it everywhere. So it would, if we just made it compulsory, all of these other things would contribute to the regressive nature of it, because just making it compulsory, like if that law were passed in the US, okay, there's a $20 fine for if you don't vote, all this other shit is still going to exist. That, and it won't be fixed just with this voting thing, compulsory voting. So there are also a couple of other countries that do have compulsory voting where it works a lot less well than in Australia. So for example, Thailand, for example, Ecuador, which is a comparable population to Australia. And so I think that the idea of a suite of reforms is obviously good, but you've got to have that. It can't just be compulsory across the board. again, you didn't address any of the other things. I think you kind of agree with the compulsory reforms. So like in Australia, the elections also, I don't know if you knew this, but they're totally different. Like you guys have a form of this like kind of automatic runoff and proportional representation. Here we don't have that. We have primaries, and then we have in the presidential election, just you have to vote for one of the choices. And so in Australia, you can turn in a blank ballot, as far as I know that to be true here, which is essentially not voting, right? Just kind of just going, but not turning anything in. And so that's what people do here in the US, but just without the hassle of actually doing all the paperwork and going if they don't like any of the candidates, right? Like why even show up? I don't know if maybe you're also familiar with the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, who's one of my absolute faves, who talks about how voluntary participation in a democracy is one of the cornerstones of that democracy, because it makes the election more valid that people participated voluntarily rather than being forced to. Because if you don't like any of the candidates, then it can be kind of held against you, like, well, you voted and you voted for that guy, right? But it's like, well, I didn't really want to. I was just forced to for under threat of fine, right? So there's that. So again, I really do agree with you, this idea that it needs to be a suite of reforms, but unless we do a suite of reforms, compulsory voting, as is stated in the resolution, is just really going to be very regressive, as you stated yourself too.
Okay, so that makes a bit more sense. I want to start just with the back 2 points that you made. Firstly, the idea that voluntary participation is sort of like a morally and ethical idea. I mean, I hate Peter Singer. I think he's crazy. The main reason that I point to this argument being bad is that you're still able to not vote. That is to say, you can so the participation, that is to say, the choice of who you're voting for, has been conducted voluntarily. The only question is, did you decide not to vote because you didn't want to drive to the voting booth or get public transport to the voting booth? Or did you decide not to vote because you made a genuine decision that none of the candidates were deserving of your vote? And I think that the example of Australia proves, in which there is a very small number of spoiled ballots, that once people are in the circumstance in which they need to vote, that voluntary participation still exists, and they still, by and large, give a mandate to that. And again, the example of Australia is good here. The vast majority of people say that they have a high degree of trust in the electoral system and a high degree of legitimacy in that electoral system. And that's been consistent across public polling that I'll publish in the bottom as soon as this is over. Next thing that you say is, well, why not turn in a ballot if you don't want to vote for anyone? Well, I think, again, this is just a very small number of people. And your presidential election recently was incredibly polarizing. And I just do not think there are many people who would not want to vote for either candidate. And in the circumstance that they did, I'm very happy to trade off their inconvenience in order to ensure that people who otherwise did not want to vote are capable of voting for that. So then the final thing that I want to talk about is about these sort of inconvenience degrees. So you're saying that voting is deeply inconvenient for people, and so they're going to get fined in a regressive fashion. First thing to say is that in our country, if we deal with the examples that you gave, those are not of developing countries, and I think the fact that they have shithouse government infrastructures that are very poor is probably the reason that their compulsory voting system is administered terribly. The United States is substantially wealthier than a country like Thailand. Finally, on this idea of compulsory voting being hard to do before you've had these reforms, I think the real question is, when is it easier to get reforms? I think there's a reason that in Australia you don't have those long wait times and you don't have those problems, and that is because when voting is compulsory, firstly, the expectation amongst the public is that you facilitate making voting easier because it's something for everyone to be compelled by. But secondly, and I think it's important to remember, there was a disproportionate degree of long voting lines and stuff like that in counties that were predominantly African American or college towns. And I think that's because the expectation was that those places weren't likely to vote in any setting. And as a result, there was less of a need to provide goods for them because people could just stay away. I think in a setting in which you compel people to vote, you're more likely to have fixes on the problems that you describe. Mind you, if you don't get those fixes, I'm still comfortable trading that off. Because yes, you fine a lot of people $20, but the status quo in which the poor are not represented properly across their entire government structure, that is to say the president doesn't care about them at all, seems worth trading off against that sort of harm.
Okay. The things that you said. First of all, I just want to note again that we both agree that there needs to be like a suite of reforms, and that's basically my whole case, is that compulsory voting by itself doesn't really help anything. It's the other stuff that's actually the causal element in Australia's high voter turnout. As a contributing factor. Like I can't really like parse it out and say like what's the actual or like proximate cause of it, because they do all go together. It is all a suite of reforms. I think that if it was just compulsory, you wouldn't really be able to make the case that that all of those people were doing that, that they were voting that it was just because of the compulsory element to it. I think it's also because there aren't those long lines in Australia because you have an extended vote by mail period. You have an extended absentee voting period. The voting is on a Saturday. You can register to vote a lot easier. You don't have to show a specific ID when you go to the polls, so you don't have to go and get all of that stuff. That's why there isn't all that stuff going on in Australia. And I think it's a misnomer, or I don't know, maybe just a cultural thing of thinking like, oh, voting isn't hard. Voting is so hard here that we had to pass the Voting Rights Act to be able to like have it be easier for people. And there's a huge controversy about people still trying to repeal that legislation. There is a reason why voter turnout is so low in places, and it's the government doesn't want non-white and poor people to vote, basically. So I think that is just thing that we can agree on, that's why those regressive laws are in place, the poll taxes and all of that, all of those horrible things. So this idea that there aren't many people, you said there should be people that they didn't, it's because they didn't want to think, sorry, I just got off a long flight with my 2 toddlers, so I'm like mentally. Okay, so you said that there are people who maybe they wouldn't vote because they didn't think it was worth it, or they just didn't want to drive there. Like this competing idea of maybe I don't like any of the people, or maybe I just didn't want to drive there. Both of those things are absolute realities here in the United States. I would say that's probably the largest camp of people that I know that didn't like either of the presidential candidates that were running, and that's why they decided not to vote for either one of them. So then there's this other idea of, oh, it's just not worth my time. I find that frankly ridiculous because people do want to do it. It's just that it's incredibly hard. I had to go to the DMV to get a new driver's license with my 11-month-old when I was 8 months pregnant, and I was there all day long. And I am a very lucky person where life is really easy for me. If I would have had to be working on that day or had any number of hardships that tons of other people actually do have, I would have just said, never mind, I'm not going to do it. It's too much for me. I can vote in my local elections. I can be an activist in my community. I can impact change in other ways. It's going to be awful if this guy wins the presidential election, but I'm going to figure out how to fix it otherwise. I'm not going to wait in line all day. And that's people.
I want to start off with the idea that it's the reforms that are causally related. I've got a reasonable hypothesis here, which is that if a country didn't have compulsory voting, but did have pretty much all of the other reforms that you just, so not instant runoff, but things like an extended voting period and stuff like that, you'd likely say something is probably a fair test. The UK has instituted pretty much every reform that you want to, except for instant runoff, and it's not nearly as regressive in the way that it conducts its politics as the United States. Nonetheless, the highest rate of voter turnout recorded in about 25 years was 69% at the recent 2017 election. That bottomed out at 60% in 2004. So that's still higher than the United States. And I agree there's a relationship between those two things. But it's also undeniable that the Australian system contributes to a huge turn up in the sense that Australia peaks at 88% and usually bottoms out at around 83%. That is to say, you get at least a boost of another 12% of the population. And that is, and again, I want to stress, this is another empirical thing about these systems, heavily correlated towards young and minority voters who disproportionately do not get representation under the status quo. And this is the thing that I keep coming back to. Yes, worst case scenario for our side, I'll cop that it's regressive, I'll cop that voting is difficult. When you get that kind of boost in the voting system, when you're looking at another 10, 12% minority or young people voting, that means that the system changes, and the system, firstly, that means the politics changes and politics adapts. You get more representative policies for young people and people who are statistically not likely to be represented inside of that system, which it seems, broadly speaking, that you agree with is a good idea. But secondly, it's how you get system-wide change. The reason that the United States is so bad to young people and so bad to minority voters is because they don't want them to get in, but also because there's currently no mechanism by which you hold them accountable, because there's no need to be afraid of them in an electoral sense. And then you describe that people care deeply about Trump, but then weren't willing to go through the difficulty of voting. I mean, I think that's probably true in some settings. It's undeniably true that there's a lot of people who are on the margins, that is to say, would vote, but for the fact that it is a large inconvenience, I concede that, but would vote if they had this sort of incentive playing on them. And I think that's really important here. The next thing that you say is that most people, like there's a lot of people who thought they were both bad and didn't want to vote for them. Well, those people, I think, would often vote third party in a lot of settings, but would definitely not be willing to get out. And that at least denies us the ability to see which one of them, like if any third party candidates get past the 5% threshold, which entitles them to a range of sort of like privileges under a voting system. But I think also those people should just cop it, you know, like if you don't want either of them in and you don't care that much, fine, I'm willing to fine you $15 or $20 so that we're able to make the whole voting system better. Like, I agree, this is a system that might be slightly regressive, but politics is currently rigged towards the people who I want to sometimes institute a marginally regressive tax in a very short-term period.
Okay, so I think we can both agree that when more people are included, the government is better. When more young people vote, when more people of every kind of person votes, that the government is better. So what I don't understand, the causal link, is this idea of the compulsory voting providing that. It's really this that provides that. Like motor voter, there was a state in the US, you can even look at state by state data. I have that on a different sheet, but I'm already talking right now and that was going to be part of my closing thing, is that you can see when states make voting easier, not compulsory, but just easier for people, like automatically being registered, extending the time where you can vote by mail, voting goes up a lot among all of those groups that you talked about, young people, et cetera. And when they make voting harder, like with voter ID laws, like was recently passed in Wisconsin, people vote less. And so I don't think that by saying like forcing people to compel people to do something, it's going to create this like suite of reform that all of a sudden all these young people are going to be voting just because they will be fined $20 if they don't. I think that young people will vote if it's easier for young people to vote. If they can vote by mail, if they can vote on a weekend, if they don't have to go get a new ID that says where they live in their new town with their new address on it when they're in college, which I had to do, by the way, and was really, really hard. Especially when you're 18 years old and don't know how to navigate all of that bureaucratic stuff for yourself and you're still testing it out. That's why they don't do it. In Australia, I heard that they register you to vote basically when you're taking your equivalent of like an SAT, which would be awesome, and they should definitely do that everywhere. So also the big other kind of difference between all of these systems, you mentioned the UK. The UK also has proportional representation, and we don't have that here in the US. We have two parties, we have primaries, and then we have the two parties. And so I think that it's a fundamentally different animal when you're talking about things like, if the 5% threshold, they could just vote for a third party. The reasons are many and nuanced why people don't do that. It's this idea of you're maybe throwing your vote away, or if you're throwing your vote away, why even make the hassle to go and do anything with that vote, right? Like if it's not going to affect any kind of change. And that's why there is kind of a big swell in the US now to change that party system from the inside. And that's what most young people are actually, what I've seen and in my experience, are spending their time on, which is great. So instead of saying, oh, we just need to get young people to like vote for, the presidential election, you know, Donald Trump, you know, hopefully he's not going to be around too much longer as the president, and there's going to have to be somebody better coming up next. So we need to build a bench and affect change in all of these other different ways. And that's what young people are focusing on, rather than, oh, let's just vote for the president who's going to be president for 4 years when I'm 18 years old. Let's try to focus on the future a little bit more. They're actually doing that, which was kind of my other point.
Okay, so to start, I think the big problem with your case is that, from my perspective, you go like, we need voting reforms, which I agree with. You also claim that voting reforms right now are probably not going to happen because, you know, the electoral systems in the US are run by people who broadly do not want to see young people voting and minorities voting, which means that we need to ask the question, what is the next best option? I think that it's reasonable to hypothesize then that, as I've shown you, between the UK and Australia, when the only control factor is compulsory voting, voting rates still shoot up overwhelmingly in the concentrations of young people and minorities. You agree that is a worthy, perhaps even dominant goal to be pursuing in this circumstance. The only thing that you show to try to prove this link is the idea that it's a proportional representation system. Proportional representation does not say a damn thing the ease of access of a voting system or the willingness of people to go and vote. It's just the way that candidates are selected. So it might be a different animal, but it's not a meaningfully different animal in any setting. After that point, I think then things become pretty clear. I brought you two mechanisms that the problem that you identified as unlikely to be fixed right now, which is difficulty of voting, would be fixed. Firstly, the idea that it shows that voting is something that people more broadly should be engaged with and establishes a norm that means that the political system is more likely to fix that, which is why it's probably been fixed in Australia to such great effect, as we both agree. And secondly, young people are more represented and they're particularly likely to be angry if they're made to stand in line for that long, which means that you're more likely to get federal guidance from the government about how you fix those sorts of problems. And then after that, the case kind of becomes a bit mushy. We hear a little bit from you about how voluntary voting is sort of important or something like that. I show realistically that given that most people are held out of voting by circumstances beyond their control, whoever fixed that state of affairs is likely to be more ethical. And the idea that people are donkey voting, well, I think as I showed you earlier, people have complex reasons for not voting. And if they really don't care, then they can just turn in a ballot that's blank. And that no vote would then be something that is regarded as democratically important, because it shows a genuine degree of disenfranchisement, but consider disenfranchisement from the system instead of the alternative, which is realistically just letting them be assumed to have not been able to make it to the polls. So I just think at the end of the day, this is a much more representative system. I'll just pass on the mic and then I'll burn my final minute in a sec.
So I think basically what this comes down to is I don't think that you can show a causal link between compulsory voting and youth participation and youth representation in government. Proportional representation matters because you could see somebody that will represent your specific interests. When you have more parties, you have better choices, so you're likelier to vote. Instant runoff means that probably somebody that you voted for might get a seat, rather than it's just a 50-50 shot and you don't like either one of the people. So it's a different animal that has completely different implications in terms of how one would think about who they're going to vote for. So I don't think that that's something that can just be so easily dismissed. You also talk about how just showing up at the poll and turning in a blank ballot shows like a considered abstention. Staying home shows a considered abstention too. It definitely does. And so if you're not counted among people that are voting, I think that that's a pretty clear message to anybody who's in office that people didn't come out for you. They didn't make the effort for you. So they don't like you. And maybe you need to change what you're doing. When you have fewer choices, then those you have to really consider if you want to make the effort, right? So if you have several different people with proportional representation, maybe the person who's your second, third, fourth choice is going to be acceptable. There's a smaller difference between them. If there are only two people and you don't like either one of them, the barrier to going and casting a vote for one of those people, I think, then becomes a real thing that is more forward in your mind. So it's not a small difference at all. I think that we can definitely agree on this idea that the suite of reforms is the most important thing. And so I think that basically there is kind of a win for me in this situation for the resolution as it stands, is that people should be fined for not voting in presidential elections, because that is not a suite of reforms. That's one thing. That's compulsory voting. There's so many different factors that go into all of this voting stuff. And I'm going to just pass it to you so that I can get one more stat that is on my sheet that I have to look up on another page.
We agree on the suite of reforms. This comes down to the way in which the rules of debating work. Just because you've demonstrated that a suite of reforms might be desirable, either if the suite of reforms did exist, which would be true on both sides, or didn't exist, which would similarly be true on both sides, I think that compulsory voting is good. And I've brought you examples of where compulsory voting is good, both when the suite of reforms have, and I've shown you that in the United States they didn't happen. Be good. You briefly described the idea that proportional representation encourages people to turn out. I just realized the UK doesn't have proportional representation. It's actually a first past the post system. But beyond that, that seems really marginal to me. Realistically, you're still likely to vote for people that you care about. Your main claim is that I haven't demonstrated that there's a causal link between compulsory voting and people voting. Well, the UK example proves that pretty well. But also, I think just basic logic proves this pretty well. If you increase the incentives for people to vote, and if you establish norms in the legal system that encourage people to vote, they're more likely to vote. And I think that is why it's statistically borne out that the countries that are developed have this sort of high voting system.
Okay, so I was hoping that you were going to give me at least one example where compulsory voting alone was able to make either young people or people with some other hardship, elderly, parents of young children, people from historically disenfranchised groups, makes those people likelier to actually vote. And I think that that's really what this whole debate comes down to, is that compulsory voting alone isn't going to do anything unless all of that other stuff is fixed. And so that's why I think that this resolution fails, is because all of the examples that you were able to give are places where they have all of this other stuff. And there are all specific examples of places, states in the US that have these really laws that make it very hard for people to vote, and so they don't. And so going forward, I think that that's really what we need to focus on, is that it needs to be all of these other things, making voting easier rather than penalizing people who it's already very, very difficult for them to vote.